How do we get to this stage where we ask this question whether equality is a good thing for society? I first came across these ideas about 15 years ago, asking the question, what makes a population healthy? And I subsequently saw Richard's work, spent some time with Richard, then with Kate, and I realized that they were asking a much broader question than I was. I was just interested in mortality rates, life expectancy, infant mortality, and Richard and Kate took these ideas of the egalitarian or inegalitarian structure of society to a whole new level by looking at many aspects of well-being. And so this year, or actually just last year, they came out with a book, The Spirit Level. Perhaps you can ask them what the title means, because that's kind of a confusing title to Americans. But they've taken their analysis to a whole degree of other aspects of societal well-being, and I think it's appropriate now that in the United States we ask these questions. So Richard is a retired professor of epidemiology at the University of Nottingham. Nottingham, for those of you who may recall your fairy tales, is near Sherwood Forest, and there's some link there. And Kate is a professor of social epidemiology at the University of York. And so they're going to talk for about an hour, and then you'll have an opportunity to discuss this. And then at the end, I want to explain why you have a bookmark that's been handed to you, because we want to spend the next Wednesdays of this month with those of you who want to take these steps further and do something about equality or inequality in the United States, who want to discuss some meetings. So please welcome Richard and Kate, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett.
Well, thank you. It's very nice to be here. Steve mentioned the title. The title's a horrible mistake. In Britain, what you call a level or a carpenter's level, we call a spirit level. So I'm afraid the title has less to do with spirituality, though we're happy with the link with the idea of public spiritedness, because that's pretty relevant to the thing. But actually, it was our publisher who thought of it after I'd spent a whole year or two making suggestions, talking to Kate at sort of 3 o'clock in the morning, and each suggestion I made, she made these sort of gestures of being sick at the idea of such an awful title. So we ended up without a title, and the publisher, looking at all our graphs that always had lines going like this or like this or like this, said, what about spirit level? So that's it. And then the American publisher, it was published in Britain in March last year, but it's only just come out in the USA. I don't know what they thought this title meant. But obviously they didn't think it was a problem, or were too embarrassed to say they didn't know what it meant. Anyway, we're here to tell you what you know already. I think many people have had an intuition. Perhaps over hundreds of years, people have intuited that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. I suppose I've always imagined that's true, but thought that you'd only actually notice it if there was some sort of utopian of perfect sort of equality somewhere. And as there isn't, I thought you'd never really notice it. I worked on the tendency actually for more equal societies, equal in terms of their income differences, to be healthier, I don't know, for a very long time, many decades. And I never thought that actually a range of other problems would show the same pattern. But since working with Kate over the last 5 or 6 years, we found that most of the problems that are worse in the poorer areas of our society, you know, like violence, like ill health, like teenage births and a whole range of others, are not only worse in the poorest areas of society, but are much worse in more unequal societies, societies with bigger income differences. So we're going to take you through that data and then offer some explanations. I'm going to start, and then Kate will do the middle bit, and then I'll come back to round up. Where we start is with this, these two graphs, which are really to point out a paradox. You probably can't see, but these are the names of rich developed countries. So there's Sweden, there's Japan, there's Switzerland, Canada, Australia, the USA is there, UK is there, and these ones on this side are Israel, Greece, Portugal. And you've got national income per person against life expectancy. And all we're showing here is that although health is worse in the poorest areas of our society, it makes no difference at all amongst the rich developed countries if they have more economic growth and get richer. You know, there's really, some of these societies, Norway and the USA, are just about twice as rich as the ones over here. And it's converted at purchasing power parities, so it takes account of prices. These people can buy twice as much as those, and yet it makes no difference to life expectancy. Yet within each of those countries, there is a social gradient in health like this. This is from old data from the Mr. Fit study, 300,000 white men in the USA, classified by the median income of their zip code areas. And so you see lower mortality in the richest areas and higher mortality in the low income areas. And it's a gradient that goes all the way across society, not just a difference between the poor and the rest of us. You know, even people in this audience, if we classified them by income or social status or something, it would tell us something about your life expectancy. So income apparently means nothing between rich developed societies, but means something very important within them. And the answer to that paradox is we're dealing with something like relative income, social position, social status, where you are in relation to other people, something like that. I should explain, though, and you might be rather surprised by this one, because we all know that poorer societies, developing societies, have much lower life expectancy. And here are the poorer societies. This is the same, basically the same graph, but with poorer countries on it, national income per person in relation to life expectancy. Before I showed you just these few up here, these rich, developed market democracies. In the early stages of economic development, you get very rapid rises in life expectancy, but you then get the diminishing returns. You know, as we get more and more of everything, it makes less and less difference to actual, to health. The interesting thing is, if you looked at happiness or measures of well-being, you get very much the same pattern. Standards rise very rapidly in the early stages of economic development, and then we lose the relationship. I think we are the first generation to have got to the end of what economic growth can do for us. You know, for hundreds of years, the best way of raising the real quality of life for human beings has been to raise material standards. And yet, we've got to the end of that. And we've got to the end of it just at the point where we recognize the environmental problems that continued growth creates. Kate and I are going to talk a lot about inequality. As I said, we're never talking about some utopian or hypothetical society that doesn't exist. We're simply talking about the differences in inequality between the rich, developed market democracies. And here they are. You see on the left, the measure we've used is simply how much richer the top 20% in each society than the bottom 20%. And in the more equal societies, Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden, 3.5 or 4 times as rich. But in the more unequal societies, we could have put Singapore there. We do have data for it, but the USA 8.5 times as rich, Portugal 8 times as rich, UK 7.2 times as rich. So these societies at the unequal end are twice as unequal as those on this measure. And what we're going to do is just show you the implications of that for our quality of life, for the health and social problems that we'll be going through. I think, though, this relates to increasing worry that I think people in many of the developed countries have. You know, we're materially very successful, you know, even in the recession. Our society has fabulous standards of comfort and wealth compared to anything before in human history. And yet in many ways I think we consider our societies social failures, or at least that they have many social failings. And the media are preoccupied with this stuff. You know, whether we're talking about violence or drug problems or prison overcrowding, or I don't know whether you managed to build prisons fast enough, or whether your prisons are as overcrowded as ours. But anyway, contrast between the material success and social failure. Kate and I collected internationally comparable data on as many health and social problems as we could get comparable data on. And we found data initially for life expectancy for each country, maths and literacy scores, infant mortality rates, homicide rates, imprisonment, teenage birth rates, levels of trust, how much people feel they can trust others in society, obesity rates, mental illness, which in these WHO figures include drug and alcohol addiction, and social mobility, how much people move up and down. And here you see them all put in together in one index. We used Z-scores, they're all weighted equally. So we bunged them all into a sort of ragbag index of health and social problems. And there you see it related to the measure of inequality I've just shown you. It's an extraordinarily close fit. You see in the more unequal end of this on the right, countries doing significantly worse in this index of health and social problems. In fact, there are huge differences in the outcomes that Kate will show you. But it looks like something out of physics with a bit of measurement error. It doesn't look like social science stuff at all. If you look at that same index of health and social problems in relation to national income per person along the bottom instead of inequality, you find there's no relationship. I think sometimes people think there's a sort of downward drift, but that's only because of Portugal there. And in fact, statistically, there's no relationship at all. Remember, the USA is up there. So it looks as if the differences between us matter, but the overall standards of living perhaps don't matter anymore. We were rather surprised by the work, the initial work we did on these developed countries, and we've repeated it all on the on the 50 American states. We wanted a quite independent test bed, and although the levels of statistical significance told us that these relationships weren't chance amongst the rich developed countries, we're still worried that people would say this is just some fluke. So, separate test bed, the 50 American states. The relationships aren't quite so close between income inequality and any of these outcomes, but they tell very much the same story. In our book, we go through showing the data, international data and the American states data for every outcome separately. We were also worried, not only that people would dismiss it if we just showed it internationally, but that people might think we've just chosen problems to suit our argument. You know, maybe left out things that didn't suit it. We looked at the UNICEF index of child well-being in rich developed countries. The advantage of that from our point of view is it's made up by other people. It has 40 different components. We can't be accused of making selections because we didn't choose any of them. It contains just about every aspect of child well-being you can think of. You know, is there bullying in schools? What are immunization rates like? What are maths and literacy scores like in each country? Can kids talk to their parents? All that kind of thing goes into it. One of the components is what proportion of the kids are in relative poverty in each country. And that's a bit like a measure of inequality, so we took that out. And here you have the remaining 39 components of the United Nations Index of Child Well-being in relation to income inequality. And again, a highly significant relationship. USA absolutely where you'd predict it to be in terms of its inequality. The UK does even worse than you'd predict. We do worst of all. Put that same measure of child well-being in relation to national income per person. No relationship at all. So although we talk about the problem of child poverty, the solution is not just more economic growth. You have to think about inequality, about relative income, about the differences between us. The slide that I had out of order is simply showing the same patterns for different measures of childhood outcomes amongst the American states. Teenage births and dropping out of high school have some relationship to average income, but much closer relationships to income inequality in each state. And indeed, all the others are related significantly only to income inequality in each state and not to average income. So very much the same story as I was telling you, whichever test bed you look at this in. I'm now going to hand over to Kate, who will show you some of the separate components of that graph, of our index.
That should be on.
No, but this is a separate one, Steve, for the video.
This is for the filming.
Got so many wires on me, I feel like a biological experiment. Good afternoon, everybody. I've had the dubious privilege of spending all of my childhood and all of my adult life in two of the most unequal of Western societies. I spent 16 years living here in the USA, in New York, Indiana, California, and Illinois. And it's really nice to come back. I always like coming back, but I'm a bit unsure of my welcome on this trip, because I'm afraid I'm going to show you slide after slide after slide where the USA is doing worst of all. So I hope you'll forgive me in advance. Okay, I'm going to take you through some of the individual components of our index of health and social problems, and I'm going to start with trust. So these are levels of trust internationally. They come from the World Values Survey. And what they do is they go out and they take random samples of the population and they ask them, do you think most other people can be trusted, or are they out to get you? And up here, at the more equal end, low income inequality, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, around 2/3 of the population think that most other people can be trusted. And down at the more unequal end, here's Singapore, Portugal, it's less than 1/5. I want you to think about those differences, think about what they mean, and think about what it feels like to be a citizen or a visitor in those societies, what it feels like as a woman if you need to walk home alone, what it feels like to encounter strangers on the street, to use public transportation in your work environment. And here are levels of trust for the US states, and these data come from your General Social Survey. And look at the scale, it's about the same. New Hampshire, Utah, Wisconsin, Iowa, Vermont, North Dakota, around 2/3 of the population thinking that most other people can be trusted. And down at the more unequal end, it's about 1/3. So pretty much the same scale of difference, and the same scale of difference in feeling of what it's like to be in one of those states rather than another. And if we look at social capital, we see the same kind of pattern. So what we're seeing here is more of a tendency for public spiritedness, social cohesion, and trust strongly related to inequality. Okay, this one's the prevalence of mental illness, and the data here come from the World Health Organization's Consortium on Mental Illness. It was set up to provide internationally comparable data. It uses random samples of the population, it uses diagnostic interviews to decide what proportion of the adult population have had some kind of mental illness in the past 12 months. So down here, at the more equal end, Japan, Germany, Spain here, less than 10% of the adult population with some kind of mental illness in the previous 12 months. Up here, Australia, the UK, 23% of us. And for you, in the USA, 26%. So more than 1 in 4 of the adult population with some kind of mental illness in the previous year. And I want you to note the scale of that difference. You know, 1/4 of the adult population, we're not talking about a problem that's confined to the poor or confined to particular minority groups. We're talking about something much bigger than that. Okay, health now. Here are male mortality rates working age men. And the green dots here are US states, and the red ones Canadian provinces. This work comes from Nancy Ross and her colleagues in Canada. And you can see that there's a strong, statistically significant tendency for higher mortality rates in the more unequal US states, and much lower mortality rates in the more equal states and the more equal Canadian provinces. And some of you will be well aware of the breadth of literature on income inequality and health. When Richard and I reviewed the literature in 2006, there were close to 200 studies. They were rather heterogeneous in methods, one might even say muddled, and somewhat heterogeneous in their findings, except when you sorted them out methodologically. And it's very, very clear that in nation states and large areas like US states, there's a robust relationship between income inequality and health. And a recent meta-analysis in the British Medical Journal, looking at multi-level studies which control for people's own income, found a significant contextual effect of income inequality on health in an analysis that included 60 million individuals. Moving on to violence, we've got states and Canadian provinces again. I'm not sure if you can tell, but the circles here are US states, and there are triangles to represent the Canadian provinces at the more equal end, work of Daly and colleagues in Canada. And I want you to look at the scale of the differences again. Down here in the more equal Canadian provinces, there are about 15 murders per million population per year. And up here, at the more unequal end, it's 150 per million population per year. So a 10-fold difference in homicide rates, closely correlated with levels of inequality. Teenage birth rates are higher in more unequal countries. Here in the more equal end, less than 10 births per 1,000 women aged 15 to 19. The UK has the highest rate in Europe, somewhere around 30, and over 50 in the US. And drug use is more common in more unequal countries. We've taken data from the United Nations here. They have data on opiates, cocaine, cannabis, ecstasy, and amphetamines. We've put all of those into an index, and we find that high drug addiction and drug use in more unequal countries. And rates of imprisonment are higher in more unequal countries. Now this one looks almost as close and physics-like as that index of health and social problems that Richard showed you. If you know a country's level of inequality, you can pretty accurately predict its rate of imprisonment. And note the scale here. It's a log scale. It's the only one of our graphs that has a log scale. So the difference between 10 and 100 is the same as between 100 and 1,000. We had to do that so we could fit the USA onto this graph, because otherwise you'd be curving up onto the ceiling somewhere up there. Greece is also something of an outlier, much lower down here. And in our UK news quite recently, we were told that 2 of them had escaped. So it should be even lower. The reason it got into the news was they escaped by helicopter. A helicopter landed in the prison compound and they got in and flew away. But the reason it was really newsworthy was because it was the second time they had done it. It's important to note that these rates of imprisonment are not particularly closely correlated with rates of crime. Crime rates account for part of imprisonment rates, but much more important is how harsh the judicial system is, how harshly it treats people within it. Is the system more likely to send people to prison for a particular crime, or to use other kinds of justice? And how long is it likely to send people away for? Here are the rates of imprisonment for US states. We've coloured in red those that retained the death penalty, and in blue those that abolished it. And you can see somewhat of a tendency for the more equal states to have abolished the death penalty. But again, look at the scale here. 200 people in prison per 100,000 in the more equal states, and around 700 in the more unequal ones. And criminologists here have determined that only about a third of changing state incarceration rates are due to changes in crime rates, and 70% is due to longer sentencing and a greater tendency to send people to prison. Here's conflict among our children. And what we've done here is we've taken data from the World Health Organization's survey of school-aged children and combined the proportion of those young people who say they've been involved in fighting, that is, they've been physically aggressive towards another child, along with those that say they have been bullied, somebody has been aggressive to them, and the proportion who find that their peers are not kind and helpful. And again, a statistically significant tendency for more child conflict in the more unequal countries. There's the UK, again, doing particularly badly, as it does on most measures of child well-being. And here's education. We could show you data on maths and literacy scores internationally and for US states, but here we've got the proportion of children who drop out of high school in different states. Down at the more equal end, between 10 and 15% of kids dropping out, and more than a quarter in the more unequal states. And here's data on social mobility. Now, social mobility is quite difficult to measure, and the measure we've got here is intergenerational income mobility. That is, do rich parents have rich children, or is there not much correlation between the two? In fact, what we have here are data on do rich fathers have rich sons. You need about 30 years of data to do this, so you need countries that have population-based longitudinal studies for long enough, and we haven't got enough of them that look at women when enough women have been in employment. So here are data from a few countries that have at least 30 years of data, so we can correlate a father's income at the time of his son's birth with the son's income 30 years later. Social mobility high, that correlation is low. And here are Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Canada, and Germany, with pretty high social mobility. Rich dads don't necessarily have rich sons. Much, much lower mobility in the UK, and here's the USA, the land of opportunity, and the American dream. Okay, I want to move on now to make a second point. Not only is income inequality related to a whole raft of health and social problems, but it seems that the benefits extend to the vast majority of the population. And just as with studying social mobility, these studies are quite difficult to do. What you need to be able to do is compare people in different societies at the same socioeconomic level or position. And obviously that's quite challenging. In this example, this comes from Banks and Marmot et al., a paper from JAMA in 2006. What we're comparing are white men in England to white men in the USA, and looking at chronic disease. So here's diabetes, hypertension, cancer, lung disease, and heart disease. And there are data arranged into thirds by amount of education that these men have had. The bottom third, the middle third, the highest third. And in most of these diseases, not cancer, but most, you can see the social gradient that we expect, with a lower prevalence in the most educated men. But in every case, even among the highest educated men, rates of chronic disease are higher in the more unequal USA than they are in England and Wales. And here's working age mortality in US counties. This is from our own work. These are standardized mortality rates for counties in more and less equal states. So the death rates are arranged by county median household income. So here are the poor counties, here are the more affluent counties. Counties in more equal states, counties in less equal states. And at any given level of county income, there's a clear benefit of living in a more equal state. It's bigger among the poorest counties, but it extends all the way up to the most affluent. And here's some similar data on education. These are literacy scores for young adults in more equal Sweden, Canada, which comes about the middle of the income distribution, income inequality distribution, and the United States, the most unequal. And here are the scores at this end of the children of the least educated parents. And there's a huge difference in scores between Sweden and the United States for the children of the least educated parents. But even at the top end, even among the most educated parents, there's an advantage of being in more equal Sweden than in the more unequal USA. We can see these data for a number of different outcomes, infant mortality and mortality as well, comparing Sweden to England and Wales. There are a few other similar studies, but it's clear that the impact of inequality, although greatest at the bottom of society, also has an effect on those very close to the top. Richard mentioned right at the beginning of this talk that we think we've come to the end of what economic growth can do for us in terms of benefits in quality of life, life expectancy, happiness, and well-being. And he also mentioned that we know that the economic growth that we're dealing with at the moment is something that has to be constrained for the good of the planet. We know that we have to rein in economic growth if we're going to cope with the challenges of climate change. And we believe that greater equality has a role to play here as well, and in three ways. The first is that because greater inequality increases the importance of status, if you live in a much more hierarchical world, it's much more important to maintain your status and demonstrate it. There's more pressure to consume in more unequal societies, because how we express our status these days is through our shopping. Bigger houses, bigger cars, designer labels on our clothes, etc. And as the pressure to consume is greater in more unequal countries, it's going to be harder for them to rein in that consumerism, which is such a driver of carbon emissions. And one way that we can see that pressure to consume is by looking at working hours in more and less equal countries. This work is from Bowles and Park, economists, and they're showing that in the USA, Canada, and the more unequal countries, people work a lot longer than in the more equal countries down here. And in fact, the difference is about 9 weeks. Is that right, Richard? About 9 weeks extra work per year. So think what you could do with that leisure time. But as well as the pressure to consume, there's another way in which we think greater equality is important for coping with the challenges of climate change. And it harks back to the things I showed you right at the beginning of my section on trust. And the idea that more equal countries are more public-spirited, more socially cohesive, and more able to act for the common good. And we see that in a number of ways. Here's foreign aid donations. The more equal countries donating a higher proportion of their national income in foreign aid. In fact, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands are the only countries that meet UN targets for donations, and down here at the more unequal end, a much lower proportion of income spent on foreign aid. And we can see it in recycling as well. This graph shows a ranking of countries on their performance of recycling of a range of goods. The more equal countries perform much better, the more unequal ones far less well. And surprisingly, in more equal countries, even business leaders agree that their governments should give a high priority to environmental agreements. They're much more likely to think that that's important than in the more unequal countries down here. But there's a third way in which we think more equality is important for us moving into a new sustainable economy. And it's also something of an answer to the idea that we need inequality to drive competition, creativity, create aspiration. And that is that we actually find that more equal countries seem to be more innovative. And what we've done here is looked at patents per capita as a simple proxy measure of innovation and creativity. A statistically significant tendency for the more equal countries to appear to be more innovative. So both in consumerism, both in public spiritedness and a way of acting cooperatively, and in terms of innovation and ability to be creative, it seems that greater equality might be a really necessary precondition for the changes we're going to have to make to cope with climate change. Okay, I'm going to finish here, take off all my wires, clip them back onto Richard, and hand over to him for the rest of the talk.
Richard's the one that's that. Is it that one? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to try and explain these curious results. I'm sorry to bombard you with this, but it really is an important relationship that hasn't been sufficiently recognized, and it is absolutely key to improving the real quality of life for the vast majority of the population. I want to come back to this index we showed you early on, all this health and social problems in one rag bag, as it were. I want to come back to it. First, to point out that, of course, the effect of putting these things together, it produces a closer relationship because that tends to, in combining them, you emphasize the common variance. What this graph tells you is that these problems do all have roots in inequality. There are wide scatters on many of the graphs Kate has shown you because there are many other things that affect them besides inequality. But inequality is one of the things that affects all those outcomes. You've probably noticed, as you know, one can't help noticing that it's always the same countries that do badly. It's always the USA, Portugal, UK, often New Zealand and Australia as well. And at the other end, it's always the same countries that do well. Finland, Norway, Sweden, Japan, and the others ranked in the middle. So what we're looking at is a sort of a broad pattern of social dysfunction related to inequality. It's not just that one or two things go wrong. Most things seem to go wrong. And indeed, you know, if you know a country does well on health, it probably means also that it imprisons fewer of its population, or its kids do better at school, or there are less drug problems. These things, broadly speaking, move together. That affects the kind of explanations we can offer. It's no good trying to explain this by thinking of something that just affects health. It's no good thinking of something that would only explain the patterns in the American states. You've got to think of things that explain the lineup internationally and in the states across these whole range of problems. Some people suggest that it's English-speaking countries that do badly, people who haven't actually who hear about our book without actually having looked at it. And the answer to that is quite simple. Take off the English-speaking countries, USA, UK, New Zealand, Australia, you've still got a perfectly good, significant relationship across the rest of them. Or put them back, and other people decide off the top of their heads to say, well, it's the Nordic countries, they're a funny lot. Okay, take them out. You've still got the relationship. And indeed, you can take a few countries, even though we've got very few countries with all this data available, you can take a few of them off each end and you've got significant relationships. It doesn't depend just on the USA or just on Japan. Some people say, well, it's the small countries. That's not true either. Portugal is small. Singapore, when we have data, is up there. In fact, if you control for population size, the correlations get even higher because actually the biggest countries are at opposite ends, USA and Japan. That's not an explanation. Some people say it's ethnic mix or immigration. That's not true either. The proportion of foreign-born is the same in Sweden as, roughly the same in Sweden as the United States. And your biggest migrant group, immigrant group, are Hispanics, whose health is remarkably good. In many measures, it compares quite well with non-Hispanic whites, despite their low social status and low education and incomes. The other reason why you can't attribute it to ethnic mix is that, as Kate's shown you, these aren't things that can be driven and explained by just what's happening amongst the poorest 5 or 10%, amongst the minorities. It extends right across the society.
And she showed you the contrast between health in the United States and the UK, or at least England and Wales, confined just to the white populations. So that's not an explanation either. I did wonder, I thought it was very likely that at home there's increasing concern that what the Conservative Party calls our broken society can be explained in terms of broken families. So we got data out on the proportion of single parents in different countries. We know from many, many studies within each country that the children of single parents do less well. And the arguments are academic arguments about whether that's explained, how much of it's explained by their low incomes, by their relative poverty, by maternal depression, things like that. But if you relate the proportion of single parents in different countries to that UNICEF index of child well-being, there's no relationship. And for those who worry that, the reason why that's so is, of course, that the countries up here at the top with high standards of child well-being, but also quite high levels of single parenthood, provide good support to parents. Many, many, many fewer of their single parents are in relative poverty. So it looks as if the government can offset these effects. It also looks as if by providing good support to single parents, you don't actually encourage single parenthood, which is a common fear. So I do think one has to, we're not making a big jump when we tell you that this pattern really, we do have to think of it in terms of inequality. I showed you right at the beginning that these problems, or at least I showed you that graph of life expectancy, no relationship with average income per capita in different countries, and yet such a strong social gradient related to income within each country that shows that it's relative income or social position that counts. And all of you know that these problems are worst in the poorest areas. You know there are social gradients in these things. All we're saying is that if you increase the social differentiation, the social status differences, it makes the problems worse. That's not a big jump. Indeed, you might almost have predicted it. So why are we so sensitive to inequality? And I think it is puzzling. Most people, I think, would feel they don't know differences in inequality between countries. And yet I think other people say, well, actually, when you go to more equal countries, you can feel the difference. And we've recently been to Sweden. You just feel much safer on the streets. You don't worry about who's around you or who stops and asks you a question or something like that. And you notice in the greater trust, people don't check your rail tickets or bus tickets in the way they do in Britain, or I assume here too. So we do pick it up, we do feel it. But why? One of the big changes in our understanding of population health over the last 20 years is that it's not simply your poor material circumstances that damage your health directly, but it's what you feel about your circumstances. The sense of hopelessness, of anxiety, depression, stress, and those kinds of things. And increasingly, we understand how chronic stress affects the immune system, the cardiovascular system, and very many other physiological processes. But the main groups of psychosocial risk factors seem to be social status itself, i.e. not simply living standards, but where you are in relation to other people. Weak social affiliations. Any measure of friendship seems to be, friendship is highly protective of health. And whether it's the quality of your relationship with your partner, how many friends you've got, or whether you're involved in community life, all of those seem to be protective. And stress in early life, both maternal stress in pregnancy that affects fetal development, and things like poor attachment and domestic conflict in early childhood. But I suspect as all those things are telling us about one underlying kind of social anxiety, that the insecurities that go from perhaps a difficult early childhood are rather like the insecurities that go with low social status, a feeling of not being valued, insecurities of that kind. And friendship fits into that pattern because if you have friends, you feel appreciated. They value you. Whereas if people ignore you, don't choose to sit next to you, don't include you in things, we all start worrying about being unattractive and boring and socially gauche and those kinds of things. And indeed, as social beings who depend on for their way of life on learned behavior rather than instinct, we learn our behavior through our sensitivity to each other's eyes. The reason why we don't do stupid things in front of other people is of those feelings of shame and embarrassment. And the American psychologist Thomas Sheff talks about shame and embarrassment as the social emotions. It's because we're so sensitive to the way we're seen that we conform and behave in acceptable ways. But that same sensitivity also makes us vulnerable to being looked down on, to social status issues. As people in health got more interested in stress, there were an increasing number of experiments done usually by psychologists who invited usually student volunteers into the laboratory, exposed them to some experimental stressor while measuring their levels of stress hormones, principally cortisol. Two people, Dickerson and Kemeny, came along and reviewed all those studies. They found 208 of them. And they reviewed them with an interest in what kind of experimental stressors most reliably raised raised cortisol levels. You know, was it doing mathematical problems, or was it having to write about an unpleasant event that had happened to you, or was it being videoed while you do something? Did it make any difference whether you had to read your marks in front of other people after you'd done these maths tests? You know, all sorts of experimental stresses used. But what they found was the experimental stresses which were most reliably raised cortisol levels, i.e. the stresses which were most sensitive to, are tasks that involve social evaluative threat, threats to self-esteem and social status, i.e. to do with how you're judged and seen by other people. Very much confirming the interpretation I just gave you of those psychosocial risk factors for ill health. And indeed, the same picture seems to explain why violence is more common in more unequal societies. It's not the poor attacking the rich as inequality gets greater. It's people feeling looked down on. People in societies where, because the status differences are bigger, we judge each other more by status. There's more status competition, more status insecurity. And if people are denied access to the cars and incomes and jobs and so on that are the outward markers of status, they get pretty sensitive to how they're seen and treated. And those are the triggers to violence. One other set of indicators of our sensitivity to these sort of things comes from a wide range of experiments on what's called stereotype threat. This example comes from researchers at the World Bank, who gave Indian children from different castes, high and low castes, a task to do. They gave them some mazes on paper and asked them just simply to find their way into the center of the mazes. And they did them under two conditions, one where they didn't know each other's caste, and then again when they'd had to say what their father did, which village they came from, so they all knew who was high and low caste. And you see, where they didn't know each other's caste, they did equally well. But as soon as they knew each other's caste, a big difference opened up. And you probably know that the experiments showing how sensitive we are, whether you trigger these sort of stereotype threats around ethnicity or gender differences, or you may even know the blue eyes experiments that were done in primary schools in the United States a long time ago. We're very sensitive to these things. and these social judgments seem to affect performance. I think, though, to understand these issues, and really what we're talking about, I suspect, is whether the social hierarchy in a society is like that, a quite steep social pyramid, or whether it's much flatter, like that. But these things do not just involve the adult experience of society, of their social status, of how much cooperation, how much competition there is, how much concern with social status. Inequality also seems to be related to childhood outcomes. Kate showed you, I think, childhood conflict, but it also affects childhood obesity and several other measures. And I think one has to see not only adults experiencing these things, but also see how the parental experience of adversity is passed on to children, usually quite unconsciously. So you know you're a depressed parent and you don't have time for your children, or you're bad-tempered with them because you've had a bad day, or whatever it is. And those sorts of things seem to have rather similar effects on early childhood development. And often people have just called children damaged if they've had a difficult early time. But actually, that early sensitivity that affects levels of, stress responses throughout life, is therefore, it has an evolutionary function. Early life serves as a taster, or did serve in our evolutionary past, as a taster of the kind of society we're growing up in. You know, are we growing up in a society where we depend on cooperation, where our security depends on the goodness of our relations with other people? Where do we depend on empathy, where we need people to cooperate with us and must trust in them and get them to trust us? Or are we growing up in a society where other people are our rivals, where we just fight for what we can get, watch our backs? The two need quite different emotional and cognitive development, and that's what that early sensitivity is about. This is what's been happening to income inequality in the United States. From 1975 to 2004, a broad upward tendency. At home, we had a very steep rise in inequality in the mid-1980s particularly. And I don't know about here, but at home in Britain, people definitely feel that our society has become tougher and coarser and more antisocial. We can feel it. I don't know whether you feel the same here. If you haven't already had too much of this, you can find more of it on the Equality Trust website. You can download most of these slides from the Equality Trust. In our book, we have a chapter on each of these problems, talking about the likely causal links, explaining the graphical evidence that we've been showing you. But I think the really important thing to bear in mind, where to leave this, is that we're talking now about the quality of life, the real quality of life for human beings, no longer helped by increasing material standards. That's just status competition and consumerism, materialism, and people know that actually we do that while losing out on more important things like family, community, friends, and we're going to have to deal with that if we're going to respond adequately to the need to reduce carbon emissions. That the way now to improve the real quality of life is to think about the quality of the social environment and social relations, and to realize that that is built on material foundations. It's not something that we all need individual psychological therapy for. Governments, policymakers, industrialists have a handle on this. The quality of social relations in our society, trust, involvement in community life, levels of violence, are all affected by the scale of income differences between us. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So now please come up to the mics and we welcome some questions and comments and reactions.
Well, thank you very much for telling us all about this. I've heard a lot of this before, but it's updated. I couldn't help but notice that in a lot of the graphs you showed, and I couldn't see all the detail, but it seemed to me that at the less desirable end of the graph, the states in the United States tended to be what we call the red states, the southern states. Those that vote Republican tend to vote Republican. And there is also some other work about dysfunctional states, dysfunctional countries, related to the degree of religiosity. And in that work, as I recall, the US and Portugal also seem to be gathered at the more dysfunctional area.
You talk about which states, and I'll come in.
It is true that if we look at our figures on income inequality across US states, there's certainly a cluster of southern states that do rather poorly, but New York is actually the most unequal on our list, and I don't think you can explain the findings across the range of the 50 states simply in terms of a particular history of those southern states. I don't know about religiosity. I mean, Portugal and the USA certainly are societies with a very high degree of people who would say that they are religious. But I want you to notice on this one the difference in position between Spain and Portugal. They are so alike culturally in so many ways, and in fact they are very alike in their recent political history, both having had dictatorships until the 1970s. We did look at religiosity as a potential explanation of the differences in teenage births and found that it didn't explain those things. But Spain and Portugal, so alike in so many ways, but they're very different in their income inequality, and how they do in their levels of health and social problems is closely tied to that. I think you want to add something.
My impression, actually, I thought that in some countries religion appeared to be a positive thing and in others a negative thing. I thought in Italy it was positive. In Roseto, that famous, from an epidemiological point of view, famous town, Italian-American town in Pennsylvania, it appeared as part of the protective things, but in other countries it seems to be perhaps related to a sense of lack of control over other things, which maybe feeds into religiosity, but I really don't know about these things and can't answer that properly. But I would be absolutely astonished looking at this graph if you could show that this relationship was knocked out by controlling for religion. And you've got Catholic countries in the middle, you've got Protestant countries at either end, and Japan, of course, is neither. I don't think that's a runner myself.
Yeah, it's kind of a self-selective list of countries on those charts. I wonder if you had included countries like China, India, Indonesia, Russia, Mexico, all of South America, all of Africa, that the United States wouldn't come out, and the UK wouldn't come out looking so badly as far as life expectancy goes. What's your answer to that?
Well, I'll start by telling you how we selected the countries, and then let Richard say something about inequality in the rest of the world. We chose the countries to include. We wanted to work only with the rich, developed countries where we think the role of economic growth has come to an end in terms of life expectancy, happiness, and well-being. We took the 50 richest countries in the world, and then we dropped all of those that had a population less than 3 million, because we didn't want to include tax havens like the Cayman Islands. We also dropped those that didn't have good data on income inequality. And we were left with a set of 23 countries. On this graph, you can see 21. We sometimes have data for Israel and Singapore, but not for all outcomes, which is why they're not in the index.
Yes, people have looked at inequality in relation to, you can't look at it in relation to most of these outcomes in developing countries because the data just isn't there. But you can look at inequality in relation to life expectancy and infant mortality, usually in those countries. And in a review we did of 168 analyses of the relationship in different settings around the world between inequality and life expectancy, infant mortality, the evidence shows clearly that inequality matters even in much poorer countries. The real difference is that in the poorer countries, average income levels matter too. So there's, we're not excluding those countries in order to have the USA worst of all. It's simply that we were interested in the societies that have got beyond what economic growth can do for us and have data on this wide range of health and social problems so we could address this issue of why there is this apparent social failure despite the high material living standards.
I'm worried I'm going to be repeating the question in some way, but I'm curious about this man, Jean-Paul Baptiste, who was kidnapped by the United States, used to run Haiti, and had a slogan of poverty with dignity. And I understand that it's not what you're studying, and maybe you've just already said it, but I wonder if you think that slogan fits with the general viewpoint you're putting forward, that in poor places, if you equalize the economy anyway, regardless of the fact that we don't have enough resources, that would...
I think that's very relevant because it was an American anthropologist, Marshall Salins, who said, I think thinking primarily of developed countries, that poverty is not a certain small amount of goods. It's an invidious social distinction. It's, I think he said, a distinction between classes or something like that. And actually, Steve Bezrushka, who introduced us, who knows Nepal very, very well, I remember telling me that people in the remotest areas don't think of themselves as poor. It's people who live nearer the towns, nearer the main roads, who can make those comparisons that make people feel poor. But I think you're right as well in that what is important is, if you like, the psychosocial effects of being stigmatized, of poverty and low social status being stigmatized. And when people ask me often about, isn't this ethnicity or something like that, insofar as ethnicity is part of the picture, or where it's not skin color, sometimes it's language differences or religious differences, those things come to be stigmatized only when they go with social status and become markers of low social status. All those problems matter more when they become markers of social status and accompanied by big inequalities, material inequalities. I think, well, I should leave it like that, probably.
I think what you guys said in a nutshell was said like 25, 30 years ago by Jesse Jackson when he was running for president the first time. He said, he was talking about oppression, inequalities, and he was talking about the person, he said, imagine yourself being in a ditch, and the oppressors got you in a ditch, but in order to oppress you, his foot has to be there in the ditch with him. And so this is like, all these inequalities, all the fact that like in the wealthy countries where even the most wealthy people aren't as good as, don't have the same healthy outcomes as people in the other, like Sweden, is because of that. You know.
I think you're right that probably many people in the past have managed to encapsulate this in more pithy phrases than we will ever manage. The French revolutionists with liberty, equality, and fraternity perhaps were among the first to do so and certainly won't be the last. Martin Luther King's beloved community. It's a bit like, I suppose, what we think we're doing is we're actually giving an empirical evidence base for those intuitions and for those feelings we had before. It's a bit like whenever I describe research I'm doing to my mother, and she says, well, don't we already know that? And I say, yes, but we need to show it. So I think the contribution we're making is accumulating this empirical evidence base that even The Economist, which is a fairly non-progressive publication, said was beyond dispute, and challenging the world, I suppose, to come up with solutions and think about how to achieve liberty, equality, brotherhood, and the beloved community. Thanks.
At the beginning of your presentation, you showed, it looked to me like you were measuring social inequality in rather coarse blocks, like you were comparing the richest 20% to the poorest 20%. And I was wondering if you've done anything to look at or investigate or tease out the effect of the super rich class, the very, extremely wealthy and powerful minority that's calling the shots in the political system.
Yes, you can get, at least for some countries, data on what's happening at the very top. And the picture is very, very clearly over the last few decades that it's the rich who have been pulling away from the rest of us. And one possible explanation or contribution to the explanation of why inequality seems to affect the vast majority of the population might be that we are all feeling more deprived or having more difficulty in keeping up with these people who get the bonuses and the celebrities and so on that people are reading about all the time. But in general, if you look at the graphs of what the top 10% or even 1% have got, people have recently produced evidence on that, at different periods in the 20th century, it looks as if it follows very much the broad trends in inequality. I mean, our societies were pretty, or at least the United States and Britain pretty unequal until around the Great Depression. Until 1930-ish, and then our societies became more equal. They became more equal still during the Second World War, and that continued in the 50s and 60s, but petered out in the 70s. And then, from then on, we get the widening of inequality again, until it's back now at the sort of levels it had been right early in the 20th century. And certainly what's happening to the top few percent does seem to govern what's happening elsewhere. And I suspect that it is that bonus culture, the huge incomes at the top, that leads people, I mean, it happens first in the private sector, it then spreads in European countries to the public sector, and it spreads from the CEO to the people below them and so on. It's a bit as if we're all on a bit of elastic and it gets pulled out at the top and the differences widen and people play catch up all the way down.
I'll go ahead. I'm curious if you studied whether there's a relationship between income inequality and population growth, or in other words, the number of children people are having within a country.
No, we haven't. It's a simple answer.
Can I should tell you one thing that we forgot to mention in our presentation, and that is that the one serious problem which you might think goes with inequality is suicide. In fact, suicides are higher in the more equal countries. A really important exception. One of the reasons, however, is that in many countries suicide doesn't have a social gradient. There was a famous paper on health in Harlem in New York showing how appallingly high death rates were. The only cause of death that wasn't higher in Harlem than the rest of society was suicide. And indeed, we think there's some truth in the sort of cliche that violence either goes in against yourself or outwards. And so homicides and suicides often seem to move inversely. That's why we think it's doesn't fit the pattern you might, but I just felt it was important to tell you that.
Not sure what that's got to do with fertility levels, but never mind.
Nothing, but I was feeling, I was feeling bad presenting you just the one side.
Over here now.
Hey, so I noticed on your last slide over the past decade, you showed the U.S. income inequality rising. And I was wondering if you were able to take individual countries and on a time scale compare income inequality with changes in index of health and social problems. And then also, if you have, does that pattern difference in comparison to, say, countries like Japan who are on the low side of the spectrum or the US who are on the high side of the spectrum?
The simple answer again is no, but the more complicated answer here is
yes.
Yes, but. No, and certainly this is an area of research where we hope to put a lot of effort into in the future. We don't have good, long time series of high-quality income inequality data for a large enough number of countries to be able to do the kind of work you suggest. The other challenge in doing longitudinal work is deciding what the lag times ought to be. Life expectancy is probably affected by a person's experience of inequality across their lifetime. But Stephen Bezrushka here has actually done a very interesting analysis of the contrast between the United States and Japan post-Second World War. Back at that time, you were among one of the most equal countries in the developed world and ranked very high in terms of your life expectancy and health. And Japan at that time was very hierarchical and had very poor health. And since that time, you've swapped positions. You've had a rise in income inequality and a lowering of your performance in terms of health. And Japan has had the opposite trend: much greater equality, much better health, and lower levels of violence. But clearly these longitudinal analyses are going to be very important once we have enough data and once we can figure out the lag periods.
Yeah, there are actually several studies which show correlations over time. In, for instance, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union during the transition period, the rises in death rates during that period seem to be related to the amount of inequality, the changes in inequality. People have done similar studies in the Russian regions. But as Kate said at one point, there are 200 different studies of the relationship between health and inequality, and you're not going to find these things always cropping up together unless they're moving together over time. But the lag periods really are difficult. I mean, probably every cause of death has a different lag period, some addressable to early childhood. And with things like homicide, we know that young adults, when they find themselves jobless and so on, you'll get a rise in violence. We also know that children who suffer violence grow up into more violent adults. So difficult lag periods.
First of all, thank you very much. This has been fantastic. And I want to ask you about the kind of implications in terms of policy and structure. It seems to me that as long as we have a society that is driven by the drive for profit and competition, and the concentration of wealth kind of goes along with that. So the last 30 or so years, we've seen, as you just said, the trend has gone in the wrong direction as far as the concentration of wealth. It seems like every time we win some reforms and move things back in a more equal direction, then the drive comes back to reconcentrate wealth at the top. And so I'm wondering what you think about actually replacing the current capitalist system with a system based on socialism with the idea of real equality.
Okay. I'll start. One of the things we didn't mention during the presentation is that it doesn't seem to matter how you get your greater equality, just that you achieve it somehow. And here, Japan and Sweden offer a really interesting contrast. Japan has lower income inequality because it has a smaller difference in earnings to start with. Sweden has more income equality because although it has quite large differences in earnings, it redistributes through tax and benefit systems. And we see similar contrasts between different US states, with Vermont, for instance, being rather more like Sweden and New Hampshire rather more like Japan, but both of them achieving quite good levels of equality and consequently having lower level of health and social problems. I'll let Richard talk a bit more about different kinds of policies.
Yes, I should say, I suppose since, I don't know, the 17th century, business has been driven by profit-seeking. That fact alone can't, of course, explain why some countries are more equal than others. All these are market economies, and nor can it account for the trends in inequality over time. So I don't think we should feel that because business is driven by profit-seeking that the situation is hopeless. What we do think, though, is that the short-term answer, I suppose, is taxes and benefits, yet the weakness of relying on taxes and benefits is that the next government along can undo any gains you make that way. It seems to us it's important to get greater equality more deeply rooted in our society. And I think it's fairly clear that the whole bonus culture and the huge incomes that CEOs have been paying themselves up, well, they've gone on actually despite the recession, reflects a lack of any kind of economic democracy or workplace democracy. So we think part of the solution should be to support more mutuals, more friendly societies, more owner occupation,
Employee ownership.
Employee ownership, more employee share ownership schemes, cooperatives, a whole raft of things like that that bring industry and work institutions under more democratic control. It's interesting, I was once going to do a study of employee-owned companies, comparing them with, I was going to do 10 employee-owned companies and 10 others, and see how employees fared in a number of different ways. In fact, I didn't get the research grant, so I haven't been able to do it. But one of the things people say about employee-owned companies is that it turns a company from a piece of property into a community. And of course, it is at work that we are most subjected to hierarchy, with bosses and a clearly stated sort of ladder in the hierarchy. It's also where income is not only created, but also divided. And it does seem to me that we might think our bosses should get twice as much as us. You might even think 10 times as much, but you probably wouldn't think 300 or 400 times as much. So I think we should regard those huge incomes at the top as an indication of the lack of democracy. And whereas people, I think, often felt during the Cold War that the cost of greater equality was that you lose your freedom, you lose the freedom of speech and so on, of the media and all that in those Eastern European countries, that actually this is the way we gain greater equality, by increasing freedom, by increasing democracy.
Yes, I was wondering, what does one do when creativity, which it breeds tangible things, and it breeds consumerism, and that's part of the human nature. What do we do with our creativity when creativity breeds tangible things? And also, what do we do with our time when we run out of time for our friends and family?
Recently, back in Britain, we went to a festival. It wasn't the kind of festival you're probably thinking of. It was a festival for people who like statistics, probably. But it was hosted by the New Economics Foundation, and it was a festival about sustainability and that sort of thing. And one group there were handing out ration books. And they were ration books with little stamps of, if we were to live in a sustainable world, what would we be able to do? And because these were quite severe in what you would be able to spend, they had a list at the back of what can you do that doesn't cost anything, and what can you do with your free time. And it was quite a long list, and some of it was a bit hokey, like hug a friend and hug a planet. But it was to do with having time for friends, community, and family. And when we were starting our research, we came across a US-based survey conducted by the Merck Foundation that asked people about their values. And the vast majority of these respondents, these US respondents, felt that materialism was a problem in society and that it had taken away what they really valued, which was time spent with family and friends and with each other. But what they also thought was that they were the only people that felt that, and that the rest of the world felt differently and really was consumerist, materialist, etc. And when they were brought together in focus groups and discovered that actually most people felt like them, they were very reassured and felt very optimistic. But I know that, Richard, you wanted to say something about what do we do with our creativity?
Well, I think you should see that I remember that graph Kate showed you of patents per head of population. They're higher in the more equal countries. It's not a close relationship, but it's not the other way around. It's not these high wages and incentives and pursuit of profit that actually creates the greatest creativity. That's partly because you waste a lot of your talent by kids dropping out of high school, through drugs, through educational failure of different kinds. But I think also our ideas about what human nature is, your ideas about human nature are largely gathered from your society and are socially conditioned. In fact, in most of the human existence, while we've been what they call anatomically modern human beings, 90% of that time we lived in extremely egalitarian hunting and gathering societies based on food sharing and gift exchange, where there was very little suggestion of social hierarchy. And actually, increasingly, I think what our work is about is recognizing our social needs, our unmet social needs, which contribute to those high rates of mental illness and many of those other problems, which contribute also to drug use and so on. You know, the extremely high levels of anxiety that our society based on competition, which actually, you know, in terms of human existence, this is a very recent phenomenon. It's not human nature.
Thank you.
We've come sort of to 5 o'clock, but I see all these people wanting to ask questions, and I think that many of us are still engaged. So those of you who have to leave, please do. But if Richard and Kate don't mind, can we continue?
Well, as long as we get some dinner at some point.
We got to get some dinner.
I need to know where my next meal is coming from.
And Kate, and don't forget, Kate's mother said, didn't we always know that? But yes, we have to share, we have to show it. And so next Wednesday at Douglas Truth Library, the following Wednesday at Capitol Hill, after that at Lake City. Show up and see if we can show this to others.
I'll try to be brief. I'm having a little trouble struggling to understand the connection that you are making between income inequality and shame or status anxiety. Maybe because in the examples, for example, that you gave of incarcerated men, you have fairly similar incomes, very low and similar incomes of incarcerated folks. And in Japan, of course, status, loss of face is a huge cultural trope, but they happen to be on the low inequality end of your spectrum.
Yes, I think you need to think not simply of people in a particular institution, because we're all aware of our position in the overall social hierarchy. And so the studies of inequality in neighborhoods, for instance, the inequality in a poor neighborhood doesn't explain the poor health or the poor other outcomes in those poor neighborhoods. But the fact that that whole neighborhood is deprived in relation to the rest of society and feels looked down on by the rest of society is what seems to count. In prisons, it's interesting, there's a tendency, I think, for people to maintain status through things like snobbishness, downward prejudice of every kind. I mean, that's what goes with the stigmatization and so on of poverty and often minorities lower down in society. But one of the ways you improve your status is by saying, at least I'm better than those people below me. And there's a lot of evidence of that. I mean, feminist literature often points out how humiliated men are more likely to be violent to their wives and children and so on. But in prisons, you see it very clearly. Humiliated people, and who do they take it out of? They take it out of the sex offenders. It's the sex offenders who have to be protected from the violence of other prisoners. And the other prisoners are basically saying, at least I'm better than those bastards. So I think you have to understand it in that sort of way. And in Japan, people often point to the fact that there's sort of respect for your superiors, and you know, people make these little bowing gestures to their superiors. I've heard people say that the difference between United States, Britain and Japan in, for instance, pay negotiations is in the United States, the knives are out. In Britain, the knives are in the cupboard, but the cupboard's open. In Japan, the knives are in the cupboard and the cupboard's locked up. But I was also interested in a comparison, people talking about how Greece has a very large self-employed sector. People tend to work for themselves. Wherever they can, if they don't work for themselves, they work for relations, for an uncle or a cousin or whatever. If they work for someone entirely unrelated, they tend to do something like make the boss their children's godfather, and overlay the social hierarchy with social obligations through gift giving. In Japan, apparently the same happens. Ron Dorr, the British expert on everything Japanese, comparing British and Japanese companies, said that the shop floorman in Japan is not only expected to know all the people in his department, but he's expected to know their families, and he's likely to make the most important speech at your wedding. And again, the social hierarchy overlaid with social obligations, and so maybe softened, and its nature changes in that situation. And maybe that's why the Japanese company directors don't pay themselves, or didn't pay themselves, such outlandish amounts.
I was just wondering what you guys thought of the current healthcare debate in the U.S. I mean, it should provide healthcare across all income groups, but it won't really change the income inequality that causes a lot of evidently poor health outcomes. So I was just wondering what you guys think.
Well, I think it's a really important debate that you're having, and really important that you try and provide some health equity for your entire population. But we've also, I mean, we certainly show in our book that expenditure on health is unrelated to levels of population health. And I don't expect you'll see much difference, whatever solutions you'll come up, in levels of life expectancy or population health. I mean, you do still spend at the moment more than any other country per capita on health care, and yet levels of population health are pretty low.
But the fact that it's not the most powerful determinant of population health doesn't mean medical care is unimportant. It means it's overshadowed by the social and economic factors. But also, it's important for the quality of life. I mean, having your hernias dealt with, your cataracts, your hips and knees and so on, makes a difference to the quality of life, perhaps more than to death rates.
Richard's much happier now that his cataracts, hernias, knees and hips have all been dealt with.
Haven't begun.
So certainly you can make a pretty strong argument that if you're in the lower economic brackets, it's much worse for you to be in a country with low equality. But since many of the decisions are made by people in the higher economic brackets, can you make a compelling argument that inequality is worse if you're in a higher economic bracket?
I think we can make a compelling argument that the benefits of equality extend to the vast majority of the population, with the fairly limited body of evidence that's out there. So the top 20%, the top 10% will benefit. Their kids will do better in school, their health will be better. We can't empirically say anything about the benefits of greater equality to the super rich. They simply don't show up in anybody's surveys or data sets. They're much too small a fraction of the population. It's possible, of course, that if you are super rich, you can buy protection from the damage done by inequality to your society, living in a gated community, for example, being able to travel, move away from it, isolate your children from it. But we shouldn't, of course, make our public policy for the benefit of that tiny fraction of the population. Our public policy and laws should be designed to protect and provide a better quality of life for most of us.
That's what democracy is about.
And I think that's why, because it's powerful vested interests that do tend to control our politics, that rather than calling for specific political solutions which one government can put in place and another can overturn, we do focus more on the need for more of a social movement and for greater forms of economic democracy across the board, so that policy around incomes, minimum wages, constraining top incomes, taxes, are made sensibly by the majority of us rather than a tiny minority. It's an optimistic view of the future, but I guess it's one we hold.
Thank you all for coming. Tonight at Town Hall, tomorrow 2 o'clock in the Communications Building. Tell your friends to come.